Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I realized I forgot to put this one up before Halloween. So, hey, Halloween lasts a week anyway, doesn't it? Um, so hopefully that's very spooky. And I hope you had a good Halloween. You got lots of candy or whatever you like to do. All right. Also, I hope you enjoyed the test. I hope that was some of the most fun you had over the weekend. It seems like it because you all did so stinking well. It's actually the highest average score I've ever gotten on any test ever in teaching my 32 years here. So that's pretty impressive. Actually, yeah, on thinking about it, I guess I'm not that surprised. This is the first time I've taught this upper level course for during quarantine, and kind of provided all the kind of extra help that quarantine really requires. So you know how to study already and all that sort of stuff. So I'm not completely surprised you did so well. I put up a rough grade translation, but up on the iLearn site. But this is very rough. It kind of gives you a general idea of how you're doing in terms of letter grades. We don't assign letter grades until the end of the course after we add up everybody's points from all three tests. And as you'll see in that grade range, we actually don't assign pluses or minuses or anything like that at this point either. But we certainly will give out pluses and minuses for letter grades in the at the end of the course. Okay, so again, it's very rough. That could shift around a little bit depending on how people do on the second and third exam. If you have any questions and if you are concerned about your grade, you should have questions, and I encourage you to go over your tests, and that's something your TAs will do for you. If they have any questions or you still have questions after they go over the test with you, I'm feel free to contact me too, but I have the TAs go over the test first if you want to see which questions you got wrong and all that sort of thing. I think I set it up so now you can determine which questions you got wrong on your own. At least I think I did that. But if you're not happy with your grade, I absolutely encourage you to talk to your TA, and if you still have questions, then talk to me. Okay, you probably have a few questions on the grading of the exam and stuff. Let's see what we got here. Good morning. Good morning. It's Christmas time already. It's true. Okay, well, I know we used to not see advertisements for Christmas until the beginning of December at the earliest when I was young, but I know right after Halloween they start putting Christmas stuff in. So hey, whatever floats your boat. What's Thanksgiving? Yeah, okay, I understand. All right. Questions on the exam, or you all did so well, you're not even think about it anymore. Oh, good for you. Um, there wasn't any really curve because you all did so well. Typically on a test like this, when it wasn't during quarantine and you didn't have all the questions, so many questions ahead of time, people typically got the average was typically in the high 30s, not the high 40s. So I'm sure you all did very well. Okay, nope, the other tests aren't cumulative. No, nope, nope, that's it. Okay, looks like everybody's happy with their grade. That's good. um okay, any other questions about the class or the tests or anything like that? Okay, cool. All right, then we will yes, so somebody asked if the final is not cumulative. No, none of the tests are cumulative, right? Okay. All right, then let's go ahead and share our screen. We are going to continue to talk about visual perception, which is, of course, what we kind of concentrated on when we were talking about the different theories. But now we're going to get a little bit more specific and use the theoretical knowledge that we acquired through the quarter so far to apply to these questions. So let me do this. We're also going to talk about some developmental psychology here. I think you'll find interesting, some kind of classic studies. Yes, I will enable. Thank you for doing that, Jenna. Again, I haven't figured out how to enable it myself, so I will now enable the transcription. Okay. All right. So hold on just a sec. Let me just clean everything up here. There's my big image. I like the weather up behind me. That's kind of cool too, the lightning and thunder. But certainly there are ghosts in there, no question. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about distance perception, but we're going to concentrate on very specific parts of distance perception. You know, we did go through this a little bit when we were discussing the different theories. And we're going to, as I said, kind of use our expertise with the theories now to kind of evaluate the different types of dimensions that might be used for us to perceive depth. And then we'll concentrate, as I said, on some developmental issues in depth perception I think you'll find interesting. So when we look out in the world and perceive depth, the question is, you know, what type of visual input we're able to use to determine those sort of things. And you've seen a few of those mentioned, including linear perspective and things like superposition that we discussed when we were going through some of the theoretical issues. But what I'm going to do now is list many of the other types of visual dimensions that are thought to be used. And here's kind of a big picture question I kind of want to pose here. You know, it's kind of, you know, standard perceptual psychology that we learn about the different types of input that's relevant to distance perception. But I'm actually more interested in some ways in the bigger picture here. So you may have heard of this, and I don't know if I've mentioned it here in the class, but over the last 10 years or so, there's been this really interesting program of research that has to do with Molyneux's problem. Maybe I did mention this when we were discussing Molyneux's problem. Molyneux's big problem, not the kind of size distance sort of details that we were concentrating on. Remember, he had a bigger problem, which was if someone were to regain their sight after, or I guess, get vision as an adult after never having seen anything before, would they be able to interpret visual information? Or would would they just be too confused? Would they not be able to use it at all? If they weren't able to use it initially, how long would it take to acquire that skill? Are there some dimensions that would allow a newly sighted person to use vision right away, where other dimensions, say other types of input, might not be usable? Really interesting questions, especially, you know, as we gain our knowledge about what happens with the brain of blind people and how people born blind are rededicating the visual parts of their brain to the other senses. We'll talk more about that later in the quarter, but you've probably learned a little bit about that in other courses as well, this kind of cross-sensory plasticity. And, you know, for a long time, those sorts of questions were, you know, kind of more mind games, you know, like what would you think if somebody could, you know, see for the first time as an adult? But, you know, there were, you know, a few instances of those people here and there, but now there's a fairly sizable population of individuals who were functionally born blind or were blind at a very early age and then regained their sight because of the availability of a very simple type of surgery. And this is cataract surgery, which probably your grandparents have had, or other people you've known that are older have had. Most of us end up having cataract surgery at one point or another. It's the cataracts are the kind of milky film that grows over the eye in old age. But some people have it when they're born, or they acquire it at a very, very young age in infancy. You know, typically that was a relatively easy thing to treat with a modern medicine, but there's some cultures, some places in the world that were just too poor and too remote to have access to that. Particularly this work has been done in rural India, called the Prakash program. And what this has done is it's allowed, it's basically a technology that is very simple, but allowed surgeons to go out into the rural fields and give these individuals cataract surgery and they are functionally seeing for the first time. But what's interesting about this, first of all, it's wonderful, to be able to give people sight who've never seen before, and to do it, be able to do it in such a transportable way to make it available to so many people. But it's also allowed for some really interesting, kind of theoretical, philosophical questions to be addressed, because now there's these populations, these, sizable populations that are regaining their sight, or I shouldn't say regaining, or gaining sight for the first time, many in adulthood and late teenage years. And now these questions, Molyneux's big question, can be addressed more readily. Are they, for example, able to perceive depth right away after regaining or gaining their vision? Are they able to perceive all the different types of input that we typically think of as being important for depth? Are there certain types of visual dimensions that they can use right away, and other types they have to kind of learn to use? And so it's really kind of, in terms of these big questions, it's kind of been a really interesting research program. Also, would it be the case that we know that infants acquire different types of, cues for depth perception at different points? Would these adults who are gaining sight for the first time go through the same kind of developmental steps that addresses a kind of these bigger questions about what's important? Is it the status of the brain that kind of determines these steps, or is it just experience? And whether you're an infant or an adult seeing for the first time, you go through these steps no matter what. Okay, so these are big questions. This new kind of medical procedure can address, and we'll talk about them probably next class a little bit more. But in order to kind of set that up today, what I'd like to do is kind of talk about the different visual dimensions that are potentially useful for distance perception, and kind of classify them in two ways to see if maybe they are predictive of how people who are gaining sight for the first time prioritize these visual dimensions in being able to perceive depth for the first time visually. Okay. So the way I'm going to pose this is by talking about cues versus information. I'm going to be talking about cues as the type of visual input that typically needs some sort of enhancement, typically is less reliable, typically is more like a hint or a suggestion that's ready for inference, versus information, which will be more along the lines of what Gibson talked about as the type of fully reliable, fully trustable, trustworthy types of visual input that didn't need elaboration, and that in a real ecosystem was always available. Okay, well, that's just to kind of give us a head start on how we'll be conceiving these ideas. But let's talk about cues first. So the types of visual input that for something like depth perception that you could consider a cue would be something that would be a hint or a suggestion about what's going on in the world. And I'm talking, when I define cue here, I'm talking about this more broadly. There's going to be, cues for motion perception. There's going to be cues for face perception. But so all these characteristics that I'm going to be listing here for cues apply to how cues work in these other domains as well. We will be talking about it today in the context of depth perception, but know that these characteristics of cues are more general than that. So these things would be hints or suggestions. So something like linear perspective here. Okay, is linear perspective something that's always available? Maybe not. Something like maybe this, does this work? Nope. This is superposition. Is it something in the real world that's always available? Maybe not. Does it tell the brain everything it needs to know about distance? Maybe not. Okay, so these are hints and suggestions, and I'll talk about each of these things individually in just a second. What else? Well, there are sign signals. What I just mean by this is they're kind of like it's kind of another way of saying hints, I think. Let's just leave it at that. I don't need to get into kind of the deeper meaning of that. But let's just say it's kind of almost like, you know, a stop sign or a yield sign or something like that, in that, you know, they're more suggestive than anything else. Okay, those are the sort of cues we're talking about. They are not specific to the world. So these are the sorts of visual inputs that are not lawfully based, right? We talked about the types of inputs that are lawfully based when we were talking about that ecological approach, but now we're talking about ones that are not, and they are somewhat ambiguous. And because they're somewhat ambiguous, they're going to require some type of elaboration. And I think because of that, we can associate the idea of a cue as being something that is most relevant to the sorts of theories we were discussing before, having to do with constructivism, or I guess computationalism. I could throw that term in there too. Information processing overall. So what a cue is something that is not, you know, completely trustworthy. It's not fully informative. It requires elaboration. And for that reason, these sorts of dimensions that we'll be talking about as cues are probably more consistent with an approach that assumes that there has to be an elaboration that's done on any type of input. Okay, so that's what's meant by cue here. You'll understand more about this as we go through some depth perception examples. But we're going to contrast these cues with information. And reminding you just what information is here, I think the most straightforward way of doing that is to bring this slide back up, where we're talking about the types of visual input that has a lawful relationship to something. And remember, we discussed this in the context of global flow. There's other ones too that we can discuss. But remember what happens with global flow. When you move, for example, when you move forward, there is a lawful generation of this kind of global flow of texture across the retinas, right? And such that when the perceiver is able to detect that information, okay, they know that in fact there's motion, right? And we talked about how that's supported by things like, you know, the various rides they have at Universal Studios, and also the experiments that were done with moving rooms, that they are effective, those rides, because the brain is interpreting this information for forward motion or global flow, you know, perceiver motion in general, because of this lawful relationship to the information to the event of moving, a perceiver moving in the world. And that is something that is not like a cue. It is not like a hint or a suggestion. It is something that is, you know, always going to mean one thing and one thing only, except in, you know, amusement parks. And that is that the perceiver is moving. So that is a type of information that's very reliable. It's informative, and we can list these characteristics. Here I have this. So this, of course, is the way Gibson wanted to think about the important visual input. So information, unlike cues, is fully informative. Okay, it is fully specific to what's in the world. It's specific to the perceiver's relationship to the world. Remember, we talked about that towards the end of our discussion of the ecological approach. This notion of you know, there's something specific to not only the various properties of the world, but the various properties of the world relating to a specific animal that has a specific eye height and all that sort of thing. And that is the important part of perception for Gibson as he portrayed it, right? That there's information not just for things in the world, but for things in the world relative to the animal and what the animal can do to those things or do with those things. Okay, and when I mean animal, I just mean perceiver here. So nothing more complicated than that. And so therefore, it's not going to be the type of of cues we just discussed on the 2 slides ago. It's going to be specific to the world, and it's not going to be simulative either. Remember, that's something we wanted to make very clear, right? There is lawful, reliable information, according to Gibson, for our perception of the kind of height of this surface. Maybe more precisely, whether you're coming upon a brink that needs to be stepped down onto, or maybe jumped on, jumped over, or maybe rappelled down if you were going to be doing some mountain climbing or something like that. There is reliable information for this dimension, okay, for this H, without there being a simulation in the light to that perceiver, right? Right, we've talked about that, so we won't go through that. But the idea here is, because of that lawful, trustworthy nature of those dimensions of visual input, they do not require elaboration, right? This is the type of input that Gibson wants to identify, not just for these specific scenarios, but for all perceptual situations. What is the lawful, fully specific information that's going to allow the perceiver to interact with the world without having to elaborate, right? That's the goal of the ecological psychologist there, not to, kind of figure out what the models are that are required to elaborate perception, but instead figure out what the information is. So a perceptual process that doesn't involve elaboration is happening. Okay, so this is certainly more in line with the ecological approach. So as we now go through the different types of visual input that have been identified as useful for depth and distance perception, we're going to try to characterize them as more like cues or more as information. Okay, it's kind of a way for us to organize our understanding and also keep the spirit of these different theories as we go through our discussion. Okay, so let's talk about the types of visual dimensions, the type of visual input that would allow us to perceive depth and distance that are probably more accurately characterized as cues first. So these are depth cues. Interposition, or actually I should have probably kept the term consistent. Interposition and superposition, for our purposes, are the same thing. I realized I used superposition when we were discussing the what's his name, John Locke, and the British empiricists. It's this type of cue where if one thing is in front of another, we could interpret that as it being closer. Okay, if one thing is maybe more accurately covering up something else, right? But it doesn't have to be like that. There are situations, say, where there's things that would look to be interposed, would look to be superposed on each other, and are actually not involved in a relative depth or relative distance sort of situation. And unfortunately, this video is not working, but the video would show that there was a notch cut out of the big 2 here. And the 3 was actually behind it, even though it's looking like it's superposed. But I should mention, when you do experience interposition and superposition, the question is, how is the brain potentially interpreting something being covering up something else? And I think here we can kind of turn to our friends, the Gestalt psychologists. Remember, we talked about all the different types of laws of organization. Well, perhaps what we're perceiving here that's kind of giving us a hint that we're seeing interposition or superposition is this law of a good continuation that they talked about, where we perceive the 2 as being a full card, even though it might not be, because we kind of perceive these things as being continuous, right? Or maybe even closure or something like that would be something else that would kind of guide our brain's interpretation of superposition or interposition as being something that's useful. Okay, but as you'll see, these things are not usable in all environmental situations. They are not nearly as trustworthy as a lot of other things. Same thing with elevation. So if I asked you which tree was closer, right, of those two, you might say, well, the tree below is closer because it's lower in elevation, but it need not be like that in the world, right? There could be lots of different sorts of situations where that's not occurring at all, where something that's actually higher in the visual plane is actually closer to us. So again, these are hints. These are more like suggestions about something to do with depth. They aren't completely trustworthy. Linear perspective as well. Sometimes we just don't have these parallel lines in our environment. In our kind of man-made environment, we do have them sometimes, but with the environment that we evolved with, it could very well be the case that linear perspective was not very often available. We're very accustomed to seeing linear perspective in art and in modern architecture, in our kind of human fashioned world. But if you think about, what's out in the world that the visual system evolved to detect, the idea that there are parallel lines, kind of converging in the distance, that's probably not something that we were able to use in many cases out in the world, right? So the evolution of our visual system probably wasn't too shaped with that. That doesn't mean we can't now use it, right? We know that art since the Renaissance is used consistently, but when you think about how the visual system evolved to perceive depth and distance, parallel lines is really a human artifact. It's not something that exists very often in the world in a regular way, at least. What else? Oh shoot, this video isn't working either. Okay, I apologize. But shading and lighting, and this is just supposed to, you have a sense of the three-dimensionality of this through the shading being on this side. And while, this does, add to our experience of depth or solidity in this case, it also does kind of depend on a light source being from a very, very specific spot, which when it, comes to, again, our visual system being able to detect things in its evolutionary history, yeah, the sun is in a specific spot at any one time, and shading certainly does add to our experience of depth, but the sun moves and the sun is, diffuse enough that it actually doesn't seem to be as reliable a visual input for things like depth for depth and distance. So shading and lighting is something artists use. Shading and lighting is something that can be captured by a photograph. Shading and lighting, when it comes to our evolutionary history and everyday situations, may not be nearly as reliable as other sorts of things. What else? Relative size. Right, we talked about this. We talked about this in the context of Mini-Me and Dr. Evil, right? And yes, it is the case that we do have a sense of how big certain things should be. So people should generally be, grown-ups should be generally one size or within a range of sizes. We don't often come upon things that are identical of different sizes, like Mini-Me and Dr. Evil is kind of a fun example. But again, it really is something more of a hint or a suggestion. It's not something that's going to be reliable in all these different cases. Finally, I'm not going to show that, something called lens accommodation. And this we haven't talked about. We really didn't mention this before. Oops, sorry. Okay. What's lens accommodation? Well, lens accommodation is, here, you can demonstrate it yourself. Close one eye, put a finger out here about arm's length away, and keep your focus on that eye, Keep your focus on that finger as you bring it closer to your eye. And as you try to keep focus, you can see, first of all, it's a little tricky here. My right eye's a little better, so yeah, it's better. It's hard to keep focus. And in fact, as you're doing that, you might actually feel your eyes strain a little bit. What's going on? Okay. Well, what's going on when you experience that eye strain, when you're pulling that finger closer and trying to maintain your focus on that finger? Is your lens is changing shape? I imagine you learned this in your 110 class or your intro class or biology class at some point or another. But you might remember that the lens gets thicker when we're focusing on something that's closer, and then it kind of thins out. It's more like a frisbee or a disc when we're looking at things that are further away. And this is called lens accommodation. It's kind of reflexive, right? So, you're bringing your finger closer, you're trying to keep focus, and the lens is kind of doing this automatically. Um, but what the brain is doing here is it's actually making use of your eye, but in not a classic visual way, because it's detecting the muscular activity of that's causing the lens to change. And you can see there's little muscles here, right? Yeah, around the lens. And it is causing the lens to change its shape a little bit as you bring your point of focus closer. And that information, okay, in those muscles, there's little spindles, there's little kind of sensors in the muscles. And that feeds back to the brain to tell the brain that, hey, the lens is changing shape. So this could be some sort of cue for distance, right? This could be something we could use to perceive depth, that now the finger's closer, now it's further away. So it is often classified as a visual cue, but in some ways, it's more of a muscular cue, I think, right? It's something we call, I want to show that, something called kinesthetic. And it's a new term for us. And it's just our way of knowing where different, pieces of the body are at any one time, or what our body is doing. And typically we talk about kinesthetic information having to do with knowing where your arms are at any one time, knowing where your fingers are without looking at them. Certainly you can close your eyes and know where all your limbs are and all that. And the way that's happening is your brain is detecting what's going on with your muscles. And the way that occurs is that there's, again, little sensors in your muscles and the tendons of your limbs to know where the limbs are. It's very good at that. That's called kinesthetic input, the kinesthetic system, how our brain knows what the body's doing through the sensors and muscles and tendons. Well, that's kind of what's going on here with lens accommodation. It is typically classified as a visual cue, but it really is more of a kinesthetic cue, I think, because it's telling us something about how the lens is reflexively changing shape as it's changing its focus. So, we get a good image on the back of the eye, but, here's the muscles saying, yep, it's changing shape. We're looking at something closer. The thing is about lens accommodation, it is very sophisticated, but it only works out to about 20 feet of distance. Because, if you bring your finger way back, whatever that is, 2.5, 3 feet, however long your arm is, right? At that point, it's probably pretty flat. And no, I guess it's still not completely flat. But certainly when you go out 10, 15, 20 feet, your lens is as flat as it's going to get. And beyond that, the change of your lens shape is not going to tell your brain anything about distance, because your lens is just flat. So it can't distinguish at that point. So again, it is really something that is more like a cue. It's not available all the time. Okay, and that's true of all of these, I would believe, that all of them are really better characterized as cues. They are not always present. Okay, they are not visual dimensions that are going to be available all the time. They're not really specific to distance. There can be many, many situations where something like relative size or elevation are absolutely counter to what one might assume based on distance perception. So they are hints that distance is something that's there and something that can be interpreted, but they're not completely reliable, right? They are also things that require elaboration. We talked about, in fact, this specific example as the kind of relative size example as something that needed to be elaborated. We use this as kind of the beginning of our understanding of unconscious inference and having to make educated guesses because there was an ambiguity in the input. So this is a hint about relative distance, but it's not something that's reliable. It needs elaboration, okay? Versus what Gibson would say is actually reliable when it comes to depth perception, right? And so we've talked about some of these, right? Texture gradients. So yes, linear perspective wasn't available as we were, as our visual system was evolving, and it's not very often available to animals living out in the woods or the desert or, birds. Unless they spend a lot of time in human-based architecture, linear perspective isn't there. What is there all the time is a texture gradient. So whether we're talking about the rocks, we're talking about grass, we're talking about bushes, we're in the real world, in the natural world, in the world that our visual system evolved to perceive, texture gradients were there, right? They really were. I mean, the only kind of, situations where they might not be is in a thick fog like this morning, but, we're dealing with, even then, I don't know if you woke up early enough to see the fog, but, there's still texture there, beyond the fog. Potentially the fog will limit how far you can see, but those are few and far between, fortunately. There's other ways of perceiving those things, but, besides that, texture gradients are always there, and our visual system, Gibson would argue, evolved to detect texture gradients. It is a reliable type of information. And from texture gradients, we talked about perceiving size and slant and shape and all those different dimensions that could be available. Same thing is true with motion parallax, that whenever we move, okay, there is a differential flow of things in the world across our eyes, depending on their distance. And it is a largely available and reliable type of, this video, does this work? Shoot, I'm so really sorry. I will get these working for next class. Anyway, we talked about motion parallax being something that was out there, and our visual systems probably evolved to detect. And so Gibson would say, these are the sort of things that you could imagine an infant would be sensitive to very early on, much more so than the cues we just listed. And although Gibson didn't say this, this is the sort of thing one might predict would be usable early for an individual who had vision for the first time as an adult, right? Because these are potentially things that the visual system has evolved to detect. These other dimensions that we listed before can be used, right? We know that that's how we see pictures. That's how we, are interpreting art, that sort of thing. But, that's kind of secondary to what our visual system detected in order to perceive depth. And that is information which is reliable. One might make a prediction that, in fact, somebody gaining vision as an adult would make use of these sorts of dimensions first. Okay, we'll get back to that. A couple of other things I wanted to mention, a couple of other cues and information that have to do with the fact that we have two eyes. Okay. One is called binocular convergence. All right, so both of these dimensions, both of these visual inputs that I'll be talking about are based on the fact that we have two eyes. If you hold your finger out again, and now look at it not with one eye, but look at it with two eyes, you probably did this when you were a kid, right? It was fun to kind of do this with your friends. If you slowly bring your finger in here and keep both eyes fixated on the finger, am I crossing my eyes? It's hard for me to cross my eyes, but I used to have friends that could do it really well. Oh, all right, I'm not very good at that. But it was, kind of a fun way to cross your eyes. And what's going on, of course, is your eyes are, their, kind of angle of gaze are actually, kind of converging like this, right? And that's, even if it doesn't look like it's cross-eyed, You know, when you bring your finger in, your eyes are converging a little bit. Here's your eyes like this. They converge a little bit. Now, when you look at something further away, okay, like, you know, the wall in your room or something like that, your eyes diverge, converge, diverge. And potentially, again, we've got, okay, sorry. You know what I did is I just upgraded my computer system and I should have checked these videos. I have no idea why videos stop working when you upgrade your computer. Anyway, what we're dealing with again is something kinesthetic, right? It's something muscular. When your eyes kind of converge like this, they kind of do it reflexively. It's not like we're really thinking about doing it, but what they will do is pull on those little muscles again, and that pulling on the muscles is detected by those little sensors in the muscles and tendons, which tell your brain, yeah, your eyes are in a different position now. And even though it's often listed as a visual cue, it's really based on muscular changes and tendon changes that your brain is picking up on. Okay. How well does it work? Well, you know, when we bring something close to us like that, yes, we can converge. Often we can only do it up to a point, though, because it's stressful. You know, when I do this, I feel strain on my eyes. That's the strain on the muscles that are, you know, kind of turning the eyes. But it's kind of the same sort of thing where when you're looking at something, say, 15, 20 feet, you know, outside of you, your eyes are completely diverged. They can't diverge anymore. So this is something that only works up to 20 feet or so. All right, this only works for 15 to 20 feet probably. And at that point, your eyes are completely diverged. And anything beyond there, you can't use this type of input, this type of input to the brain to determine whether something is, say, between 20 and 25 feet or 20 and 30 feet or something like that. So it is limited in how useful it's going to be. And for that reason, it's probably more of a cue versus another type of input that's useful by virtue of having two eyes. Okay. And we will talk about that in a second, but I think right now this would be a good time for us to do one of our practice questions, take a little break and do practice questions and see if there's any questions that you folks have. So let's do that. Looks like there's one question. Sarah said, my optometrist made me use that to improve my vision. Really? She or he had you converge your eyes like this as an exercise? That's interesting. Did it work? Yeah. Well, you're laughing, but it did. No, it didn't work. Okay. Well, there certainly are, you know, shoot. There certainly are things. Your vision got worse. Okay, that's not a good sign. Maybe it's time for a new optometrist. I don't know. You know, part of vision is exercise, right? So, you know, folks that want to delay wearing glasses or contacts, you know, there's exercises you can do to kind of allow the muscles to kind of keep the lens, you know, changing its shape, especially for, you know, for individuals who are farsighted and having problems with nearer vision. You know, there are things you can do to, you know, more, I guess, robustly change the shape of the retina. But I think those only work up to a certain degree. I don't know, you know, if they're thought of as being, you know, useful beyond a certain amount. The vision can't be really degraded that badly in order for you to be able to compensate for, you know, being nearsighted through exercise. But there are other reasons to do exercises, and kids who have a tiny bit of cross-eyedness that we'll talk about later are often asked to do these sorts of things. Okay, I thought I was nearsighted up until last year. Then I was told I was farsighted. Okay. Yeah, so nearsighted means that you're able to see near well. It's the far things you can't see, and vice versa. Okay. All right. Anyway, let's go ahead and do one of our practice questions. And if there's more questions you folks have, I can work on those as well. But let's do a poll. All right. And this comes right from what we were discussing. It has to do with cues versus information. Oh, shoot. Yeah, no, this will work fine. Yeah, I just talked about this, so it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, Which of the following can be considered information versus a cue for depth perception? Okay, which of the following can be considered information versus a cue for depth perception? So you can just look on the previous two slides and your answer is right there. Elevation, is that a cue or information? Motion parallax, relative size, or linear perspective? Okay, I'll give you half a minute or so to do this. All right, another 15 seconds or so. Yeah, you guys are doing well. Okay, that's good. Most of you got it right, 64% of you. The correct answer is B, motion parallax. It has been speculated that that is the type of input that is trustworthy and works in a majority of situations and is specific to depth perception. And as I said, trustworthy. And so that is the correct answer. Elevation seems to be much more kind of context dependent. And might be useful for us interpreting photographs or paintings or something like that. But in a lot of natural situations, it's not reliable. And that's also true of relative size. And again, linear perspective might not, the idea that there's actually parallel lines in the real world available to us very much, not based on kind of human architecture and that sort of thing, is pretty slim. So it's unlikely that that's a trustworthy type of information for other animals, let alone our visual system as it evolved. So the correct answer here would be B, motion parallax, and that will be on your second exam. Cool. All right. Okay, so let's continue with this unless there's any other questions at this point. All right, and share our screen. Okay, so as I said, there are two types of visual input, classes of visual input that are associated with the fact that we have two eyes. One is this convergence that we just discussed, the fact that the eyes are changing their angle as we look at something closer, as long as it's within 20 feet. But again, that's considered something that probably is a cue because it's not going to be very useful beyond 20 feet. Unlike the other type of visual input that is something available to us by virtue of having two eyes, and it's the one that we probably have learned about more often, and that is called binocular disparity. And this is just the fact that our two eyes get two subtly different images, and the fact that they do allow us to perceive depth. One of the ways that we're allowed to perceive depth. All right, so what does this mean? Oh, shoot, video doesn't work. Think about seeing two things out in the distance. Say we're looking at a flagpole A that's closer and a flagpole B that's further. The image of A as it gets to the eye, so it goes here and here, and the image of B that gets to the eye here and here is different. The distance, the disparity between those images at the two eyes is different. And this is what's meant by binocular disparity. So I think it's hard to see here, but this says A1 and this says B1. So that's on your left eye, say, looking out in the world. And this says A2 and this is B2. So these are the images that go now to your right eye. And you can see the difference in position here between A1 and B1 is different, is disparate relative to the difference in positions of A2 and B2. And that's really what we're talking about. That's what the brain's going to be able to use to perceive depth by virtue of having two eyes. It's a much more reliable type of input, as we'll see. Okay, so the disparity, when you see that term binocular disparity, what you're really referring to is that these, the position, the distance, the difference in position of the images to the two eyes, okay, is going to be different across the two eyes. So A1 minus B1 isn't the same as A2 and B2. That distance here, in this case, the way these are configured, this happens to be that A1 and B1 have a smaller distance between them on the left eye than A2 and B2. Doesn't have to be like that, but it's the fact that there is a difference going to the two eyes that makes it important. So this is the disparity. It's also called this type of visual input is also called stereopsis, which makes sense. Stereo, like your stereo and your car stereo. Well, there's two channels of music that come out of your car stereo, even if you have multiple speakers. You probably know that, right? Left, right. So that means two in this case, and opsis meaning eyes. So the fact that you have two eyes and your two eyes are getting subtly different images is going to be important. Now, from a Gibsonian perspective, you don't want to talk about images per se. You want to talk about flows across the eye. Remember, we talked about this. But having two eyes allows the flows to be different across the two eyes. So it is, it is the same type of thing. It's just kind of construed differently. The eyes aren't cameras from Gibson's perspective. They're kind of, more like kind of sensors that are kind of tracking changes across time, all right, like hands, right? And the fact that the flows are different across the two eyes is what's important in this case. And what it's like, we can say, kind of continuing with this ecological Gibsonian notion, what it's like is it's like getting binocular it's like getting motion parallax at one time, right? Because, the thing about motion parallax is you're kind of experiencing the world, you're experiencing the flows from multiple points of observation, right? You're moving forward, there's a flow. It's like, getting a point of observation here and then a point of observation here, just moving forward. And having two eyes also allows the same thing. It's kind of like we have our heads have a built-in kind of motion parallax-like system, right, between our two eyes. And so it's the difference in flow rather than the difference in images between the two eyes that the brain is interpreting. The thing is, it's a very, very reliable type of input, okay? And our visual system evolved to make use of it. Our visual system evolved to have two eyes, to get two simultaneous perspectives on the world, whether it's a perspective on images or perspective on flows, right? It's critical. And it's something that the visual system was designed to detect. And so I think it's probably better portrayed as an information source, not cues, right? It's something reliable as long as we have two eyes. And I should say that it is somewhat limited in distance, but nowhere near as limited as binocular convergences, right? I went to the football game, went to the SoFi Stadium for the first time on Sunday. Me and my son are big time football fans. It's really something. If you have a chance, you get, I think the Chargers tickets are actually relatively inexpensive now. That's why we went. It's interesting. From the distance where we were up in the, nosebleed seats. You can see a lot down on the field. It's a nicely designed stadium for this, but boy, there were instances where we were very aware of how our depth perception really kind of failed us. And that was probably the lack of binocular disparity, because we're talking about what, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet away. At that point, hopefully you have other ways of doing, other ways of seeing depth, but, we could absolutely never tell when, the ball was kicked through the goalpost, the field goal was kicked, and whether it was good or bad, or whether the extra points were good and bad, given our distance. We had to watch the screens to determine that sort of thing. They gave you another angle there. But at that point, you're aware that, oh boy, a good thing that, your life isn't depend on that sort of judgment, because your visual system would not work very well at that type of extreme distance. That being said, if something was coming from us from that distance, we probably would. It was, kind of the angle having more to do with anything else. So yeah, cool. So you were there too, Daisy, huh? That was a good game, huh? Yeah, it was fun. And it was fun because people were dressed up for Halloween, so that made it a lot of fun too. Anyway, okay, I'm going to go back to these other questions when we take our next break. Okay, so fun. All right, so how does this work? Oh, yeah, before we talk about some of the stuff the brain's doing here, I just wanted to talk about one other instance of these, because this is how, like, I can't remember what the status of 3D movies is right now, because it's changed so much since I've been here. So when I, started teaching here 30 years ago, 3D movies were not very impressive, right? Certainly when I was growing up through, the early, say, 90s, it wasn't very impressive. 3D movies back then had two lenses. They were filmed, and then the viewer would wear special glasses. Again, this is binocular disparity, but this is through something called a stereoscope. Well, this is not from my childhood. This is from the 19th century. And you can see here these are two images that were actually taken by a special camera. I have a picture of that camera here. Yeah, there it is. Actually, this is a more modern camera than probably took those pictures. But what they do is they situate the lenses about the distance apart that's, similar to the average eye distance of, a human, and take two pictures at the same time of the same scene, and then show those two pictures to the two eyes simultaneously. But there has to be a way that, the setup is ensured that the picture that was taken by the left lens is perceived by the left eye, and the picture that was taken by the right lens is perceived only by the right eye. And as you can see here, there's this little divider here to make sure that, your eyes aren't getting information from the picture that is not intended for that eye. And, I don't know if you've ever played with anything like this. When I was a kid, there was something called a Viewmaster. Do I have a picture of that? No. That kind of did the same thing. It was much smaller and a little bit handier, and it was fairly effective. And then they had movies that were taken with special video or special film cameras with two filters on them. The right lens would have a blue filter, and the left lens would have a red filter, say. And then in order to experience that three-dimensional effect, you'd have to then, as an audience member, wear these silly sunglass looking things that had a blue filter in front of one eye and a red filter in front of the other eye. And then when you watch the film, the idea was that your right eye would get one thing and your left eye would get another thing. And it barely worked. Trust me, back then, these 3D movies, I mean, every once in a while you get a 3D experience, and people thought that was cool. And so there were 3D movies when I was growing up, and, through the 80s and 90s, but they were not very impressive. But then things started getting better. Actually, you folks may have seen movies when you were kids that were 3D. The technology was much better at that point. And I have a TV at home that came with 3D goggles, and that has to do with the way light is polarized through the two lenses, and it can be effective. I mean, it's interesting, when I 20 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe when you're growing up, it was kind of the rage that, kids wanted to see the movies in 3D if they could, usually animated movies. But I don't know if they're nearly as popular as they are now. I don't think, do the superhero movies all come out in 3D now? There was a time where they did, but I'm not even sure that happens anymore. I've always been interested in why the kind of simulation of 3D comes in and out of fashion You know, I think it's very interesting. Maybe you folks still like to watch your movies or your video games or TV shows at home, maybe even as 3D. Um, you know, with these special goggles and that sort of thing. Certainly virtual systems have this sort of thing as well. Virtual reality systems with those goggles have the same thing, but for whatever reason, you know, maybe there's one theater in a complex that has the 3D version of the movie, but all the rest don't. And I'm not sure why that's the case. Anyway, they're better than they ever were. I will tell you that. Okay. These things, by the way, are called stereoscopes. In fact, you know, your virtual reality system with two views on the world, where each eye is getting a different perspective on the scene, is an example of a stereoscope. You know, so these days it is still implemented, but it seems to go in and out of fashion for whatever reason. There are other things that are used in your doctor's office, and maybe this is why you would have a binocular convergence sort of exercise. And that's called a stereogram. And the way that works is you cannot see very much from each of the images. It's a random dot stereogram. This specific one is a random dot stereogram, where it looks like any one of these has a random set of dots in them. They make no sense. But if you can look, and I'm going to get close to the screen now, I'm going to scare you all. See if I can get this. If you're able to kind of unfocus your eyes, one way of doing it is actually to focus on something behind your screen right now, and kind of try to maintain your eye focus as you bring your eyes in. Does it work for me? It could very well work for you, given you're looking at a screen. If you have any sort of reflection on your screen, concentrate on focusing on your reflection, not on those themselves. And you might be able to see, am I able to get this? No, I can't fuse right now. All right, don't worry if you can't do it, but I believe what you'd be able to see here is a square here. And if this is done in the doctor's office, it's done much more carefully. The doctor kind of guides you through it. Sometimes they have you wear glasses to see if that, you know, these sort of polarized lens glasses, see if that works. And it's a way of checking to see how your eyes are fusing images. What you would end up seeing, if this, I believe, what you'd end up seeing if this works, is a kind of a smaller square hovering kind of in front of these squares. I don't know if anyone's able to see that. People are all chatting. Hold on a second. Let me see if people are seeing it. Okay, no, people are making comments to this. Good, good. I want to see your experience of 3D and 4D. But maybe some of you are experiencing this. This used to be really popular. In fact, there's still websites that you can go to that have these random dot stereograms where you look at an image. These are called auto stereograms. It's just in this case, it's a single image, but when looked at in the right way, each eye gets a subtly different image. And let me see if I can get this one to work. This is the first time I'm ever doing this on Zoom, so it might help that you see a screen. Let's see. Let's see. So again, look beyond your screen. I know this is kind of silly, but you just took a test, so let's have fun with this. Okay. I'm looking at my reflection, and then I look over here. No, let me try it with the other one. Let me know if it's working. So, you know, like if you can look in so what I'm doing is I'm looking at the side of my screen where there's no image, and I'm concentrating on my reflection. So my focus then becomes beyond the screen. Oh, shoot. Anyone able to get this? Anyone see any magic images coming up from this? I'll get it as soon as the class is over, I bet. No. Okay. So the idea is when you drag your eyes over to the actual images, it should seem out of focus, but then something all of a sudden will start hovering in front of it. It's kind of a fun experience. Well, fun for us nerds. Okay, let's try a few more. It'll be fun. All right. Okay. So I think some of these are easier than others. I think this money one's not terrible. Let's see if I can get it for this. Yep, I got the money. There we go. All right, I see the money. If there's something floating in front of the money, oh, I'm getting them all now. Yep. Here we go. Oh, yeah. It's working for me. Is it working for anybody else? Okay, so the idea again is focus beyond your screen, focus on your reflection. If you've got a little reflection next to the slide, focus on your reflection and drag your eyes over slowly while keeping that focus. Let's see. Your eyes should feel a little crossed. They should feel a little out of focus. Oh, maybe a couple people got it. Let's just see. Yeah, a couple people got it. Good. Keep doing it. Let's give you a couple of seconds to do it. Might as well. Yep. Oh, yeah. I can see them all now. I'll tell you what, look here, you should see a $ floating above. See if you can get that. Now that you know what to look for, it's kind of like right here. Let me do it again. Yeah. Relax your eyes. I'm having trouble again. Don't feel frustrated if you can't do it. And once you get one of them, you'll kind of shift and get all of them probably. Okay, it's hard, but you can have fun when you go after class and look at these. You know, people usually get this one, the one down here in the lower right. Keep looking at this one. Let's see if you can get this one. I'm just joking. Okay, let's take a little break here and do our question. All right. Actually, let me see your I'm very interested in your comments. Okay. All right, first of all, let's look at your comments for the why do we squint to get a better look at something? That's a very good question. Because it lets in less ambient light, I believe. I believe that that's the case. So when you squint, you might be doing something with the lens to some degree, but I believe if you let in less light behind it, you can concentrate on the thing that you're focusing on. I'm pretty sure that's it. Okay, so what are we supposed to look at? Oh, we'll try it again in just a second, but yes, there is a heart on the top left. Nicholas, you are absolutely correct. Olivia thinks it's crazy. Okay, the 364D Studio Tour at Universal is also great. So even if it's not popular in the movie theater right now, the 3D stuff, a lot of these Universal Studio rides are 3D, right? And so I guess it's effective enough. It's consistent enough for folks. I always struggle to wear those movie glasses over my own glasses. Me too. I have to usually end up adjusting both of them again and again as I'm watching the movie. They are designed to go over your glasses, but they're not comfortable. 4D movies are attractions with artificial wind, water, smell, chair. Yep, good. It's more onto Max now than just 3D. IMAX, right? I guess we're more into, is IMAX 3D typically? I thought that had to do with the, oh, I guess it would be like at the Science Center and all those places. But I know IMAX is also often a very large screen relative to the distance and often curved. Oh, Spy Kids in 3D with one blue and one red glasses was amazing at age 3. Cool. Good. Lilo and Star. All right, so maybe people really did like them. All right. Somebody asked, can trauma change somebody's depth perception? And certainly like brain injury can, and is often one of the ways that it's diagnosed. But if you're talking about psychological trauma, like emotional trauma, I'm not sure. I've not heard of that, but maybe there is research on that. It's a good question, Olivia. Okay, cool. Okay, Brianna asks an important question. Do people who have vision in one eye have a harder time with depth perception? Okay, so this is a good question. And the I guess the initial answer would be yes, because you don't have access to this kind of binocular disparity information. But as you know, there are many other types of input that can be used. So, things like the texture gradients and motion parallax is something that a single eye can use. And that can be very reliable type of input. And then there are also all those other cues. So most of those other cues that I listed, I guess all of those other cues I listed are things that are detectable with a single eye. Now, are there problems? Yeah. If you're a pirate, for example, there are depth perception problems, but they're not typically within normal functional range, but certainly, there are issues of seeing long depth or seeing kind of subtle depth differences, that sort of thing. But there are many ways of compensating. So if you completely lost all of your depth perception, if you had an injury to a single eye, it would be hard. You'd functionally be blind in a lot of ways. But no, that's not the case. There are many different types of input, again, some more reliable than others. So you do not need to have two eyes to perceive depth. It just does make it easier in a lot of cases. Okay, what else is I have? People who have okay, we're about to talk about cross-eyed and lazy eye in just a second, Irene. It's a very good question. All right. Kind of, but I'm just really curious because my mom always told me this. Do your eyes really get stuck when you cross your eyes? I do not think so, but do your eyes get stuck when you cross your eyes? No, I don't think so. But your tongue does get stuck when you stick it out. I know that. No, I'm kidding. I don't know where that comes from. Your eyes getting stuck when you cross your eyes. I don't know where that's from. I don't know. I mean, I imagine if you cross your eyes a lot, there can be fatigue in the muscles again of the eyes that are controlling it. But I don't know beyond that where that comes from. Yeah. Right. If you make a funny face, it stays like that. Hopefully you didn't make any funny faces during Halloween. All right, let's do one of our polling questions. Oh, can't do it yet. Sorry. All right, I'll do it in just a second. I'll go through this next slide and then I'll do it. Sorry about that. All right, it's about this next slide. Oops, hold on just a sec. Sorry, everybody. Okay. So yeah, try these later. I think everyone probably will experience, well, most everyone. If in fact you have a problem doing it, even if you have vision in both eyes, it's nothing major to worry about. It doesn't mean that you're not able to use binocular disparity. Typically, when people have problems with these sorts of things, it's nothing serious. It's something to do with how your eyes align. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But before I do, let me just mention this. Maybe it's obvious, but we do have cells in the back of our head, our back of our brains that are tuned to detecting differences in the either the image or flow that's on the back of the retina. So we have what's called disparity tuned cells in the visual system back here, right back here, that detect, that light up when in fact there's different input to the two eyes, and that's a relatively easy thing to test now using MRI and using binocular goggles, that sort of thing. So they are absolutely sensitive to the disparity across eyes. So the brain did in fact evolve to be able to detect that because it is a very trustworthy type of input that can be used. Now, let's talk a little bit about why some folks have problems detecting these autostereograms or using 3D goggles, that sort of thing. So defective stereopsis. About 5% of the population do have problems with this. And it's not because you're losing vision or there's something wrong with your brain or something like that. More often than not, it has to do with strabismus. And what strabismus is typically it's a very subtle type of cross-eyedness. And it's not often something that is visible by other people, right? These days, if you're a child with a wandering eye or cross-eyedness, that they can do some minor surgery and fix that pretty well. But even in that case, even if it's fixed so it's not apparent from the outside, it could very much be the case that the axes of your eyes aren't aligned quite correctly. And if that's the case, it's not a big deal. In fact, you still might be able to use the cue of binocular disparity for the most part. What you probably wouldn't be able to do as easily would be these autostereograms, these kind of silly figures that we were just playing with, and you might not be able to use those 3D glasses that they use in the movie theater or in the rides at Universal Studios. But that doesn't mean that you're still not using some binocular disparity, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're not perceiving in depth. Again, this is just one of the dimensions that is used to perceive depth. And so, believe me, you are perceiving depth, even if you aren't able to do these things or you don't have a good success with these 3D goggles at movies. But there might be, that is the most common situation where people have trouble doing this kind of fusing. So it's just really kind of a difference in binocular coordination. That's all. Your eyes just aren't completely coordinated when they're converging or diverging, and it's not a big deal. It's not, what we typically call as cross-eyedness, and it doesn't typically affect binocular disparity as a type of input. You're still able to use that, and even if you weren't able to use that, you still have a lot of other ways of using other types of input, and including convergence. Your eyes, your brain can detect convergence even if the axes are misaligned a little bit. So it's nothing big. Don't worry if in fact you can't do that. Okay, so now what are we doing here with time here? Yeah, okay, let's end here for today and do our question. Now I can do my question. Oh, there's a little more chat here. My mom said that too. She told me if you watch TV while laying on my side, I'll get the rectangular goat eye. Wow, I never heard these. These are great. All right. Both my boys do look like goats, so I'm just kidding. Okay. Yeah, people wear eye patches when they're young sometimes if their eyes aren't lining up correctly, and sometimes that can work. Surgery can also work. It's much more curable. When I was growing up, there were a lot of kids that had eyes that weren't lining up and it was visible from the outside. These days, it's much less common. Okay, let's just do our last polling question. And you know this answer right away. The most common reason that observers cannot fuse stereoscopic images is A, strabismus, B, missing cone cells, C, no sensitivity to linear perspective, D, no sensitivity to motion parallax. Okay, so what's the most common reason? What's the cause? You just saw it. Yeah. Too easy. Okay, I guess we're running out of time, so I will stop here. It's fine. Most people are getting it. The correct answer, just so you have it for your test, is A, strabismus. Missing cone cells can be one of the causes of color blindness. No sensitivity to linear perspective. You can see linear perspective with a single eye, so it has nothing to do with stereoscopic images. And you can also see motion parallax with a single eye. So that also isn't relevant to stereoscopic images. The correct answer is what we just learned on the last slide you saw, which is strabismus. Okay, great. We'll see you on Thursday. Bye.